In early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic raged on. The Atlantic Ocean, a critical trade route for the Allies, was the stage for one of the most significant conflicts of World War II. The Germans had long used their U-boats to disrupt Allied shipping. These submarines struck at merchant ships and warships, cutting off vital supplies to Britain. The situation was dire. The Allies faced the constant threat of U-boat attacks that seemed unstoppable. However, in the midst of this danger, Britain made a breakthrough. The British Navy developed a new weapon that would turn the tide in the battle: the depth charge. Before the development of depth charges, the U-boats had an advantage. They could submerge, making it difficult for surface ships to detect them. At depths below the range of sonar, the U-boats could remain hidden while they stalked their prey. As soon as a target appeared, they would launch a torpedo, often sinking ships before the crew could respond. The Allies struggled to find a way to counter this threat. However, British engineers worked tirelessly to create a weapon capable of neutralizing the U-boats. The solution came in the form of the depth charge, an explosive device designed to detonate at a specific depth in the water. The idea was simple. If you could get the charge near a U-boat, the shockwave from the explosion would be enough to damage or destroy it. The first depth charges used in the war were not perfect. They were essentially large bombs dropped from ships into the water. But even these early models proved effective enough to make the U-boats think twice about attacking. The British Navy quickly adopted the depth charge, and it became an essential part of their anti-submarine tactics. As the war progressed, the depth charge evolved. Newer, more sophisticated models were designed to be more accurate, with a wider blast radius and greater explosive power. The British also developed new methods for detecting U-boats, such as improved sonar systems. Together, these advancements made it increasingly difficult for U-boats to operate freely in the Atlantic. By early 1943, the effectiveness of these new weapons was evident. The Royal Navy had begun to deploy depth charges on a large scale. Ships patrolled the Atlantic, searching for U-boats. When they detected one, the hunt was on. The warships would use their sonar to track the submarine's movements, then close in for the kill. Once in range, the ship would drop depth charges overboard, hoping to hit the target below. The crew's nerves were stretched to the limit. They had to act fast. Every moment counted, and every misstep could cost them dearly. The battle between the British Navy and the U-boats became a deadly game of cat and mouse. On the U-boat side, the crews knew they were under constant threat. Their submarines, once masters of stealth, were now vulnerable to the new weapons. The Germans had hoped that their U-boats would turn the tide of the war in their favor, but now they found themselves on the defensive. The British depth charges forced them to be more cautious, to operate at greater depths, and to develop new tactics to avoid detection. But despite their best efforts, the U-boats were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. The tactical drama of this new phase in the battle was intense. The British warships engaged in relentless pursuit, closing in on their prey with unwavering determination. Every sonar ping brought the crew closer to their target, and the pressure built as the U-boat tried to escape. On board the German submarines, the situation was just as tense. The crew could hear the depth charges falling, each explosion rattling the hull. The constant sound of the charges exploding in the water created a sense of dread, as the crew wondered if their submarine would be the next to be destroyed. They had trained for these moments, but there was no way to prepare for the sheer terror of it. For the British sailors, the hunt was equally nerve-wracking. They knew the stakes. The success of their mission depended on their ability to outsmart the U-boat. They relied on their sonar operators to guide them, hoping for the right moment to deploy the depth charges. They were well aware that any mistake could cost them their lives. The ocean was a vast and unforgiving place, and a single misstep could send them to the bottom. As the depth charges exploded in the water, the U-boats were rocked by the blasts. The shock waves from the explosions were enough to crack the hulls of the submarines, causing flooding and severe damage. Some U-boats were destroyed outright, their crews lost without a trace. Others were crippled, forced to surface and surrender to the British or scuttle themselves to avoid capture. The loss of a U-boat was a devastating blow to the German Navy. and it became clear that the British depth charges were having a significant impact on the course of the war. The Germans, however, did not give up easily. They adapted to the new threat by developing countermeasures, such as better sonar jamming devices and tactics for evading depth charge attacks. Some U-boats began operating in groups, using coordinated tactics to overwhelm the British warships. But the damage was already done. The British Navy had gained the upper hand in the Battle of the Atlantic, and the U-boats were no longer the terrifying threat they had once been. The loss of U-boats in 1943 was a blow to Germany's naval capabilities. The U-boat fleet had been a key part of their strategy to cripple the British war effort. With fewer U-boats in operation, the Germans struggled to maintain the pressure on Allied shipping. Convoys were able to travel across the Atlantic with greater success, bringing vital supplies and reinforcements to Britain. The strategic consequences of the British depth charge were profound. The Allies gained a crucial advantage in the war, and the ability to move goods and troops across the Atlantic was restored. By the middle of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had begun to turn in favor of the Allies. The German Navy had suffered significant losses, and the U-boat threat was no longer as overwhelming as it had been in the early years of the war. The British had proven that they could match the Germans in this critical battle. The depth charge had played a major role in this shift, allowing the British Navy to gain the upper hand and break the German stranglehold on the Atlantic. The effectiveness of the depth charge had lasting effects on naval warfare. The success of this weapon demonstrated the importance of innovation and adaptation in war. The Germans were forced to rethink their strategies, while the British continued to refine their tactics. The Battle of the Atlantic was far from over, but the use of depth charges had already altered the course of the conflict. The depth charge was one of the most effective weapons in the Battle of the Atlantic. It was a simple but powerful tool designed to destroy submarines by detonating underwater. This innovation gave the British Navy a way to fight back against the German U-boats, which had previously held a deadly advantage in the Atlantic. A depth charge is an explosive device that is dropped into the water, typically from a ship or an aircraft. It is set to explode at a specific depth, making it highly effective against submarines that operate beneath the surface. The idea behind the weapon is straightforward. By detonating at a set depth, the force of the explosion would either damage or destroy a submarine, or at least force it to surface, where it could be attacked or captured. The first depth charges were developed by the British early in World War II. These early versions were not highly accurate. They were large bombs that were dropped from a ship, but they lacked precision. They exploded at a range of depths, making it difficult to target submarines that could be lurking at different depths. Despite their shortcomings, they were still useful. The sound of the explosion and the shockwave it sent through the water was enough to cause damage to submarines and force them to move. While these first depth charges did not guarantee a kill, they did disrupt U-boat operations and made the submarines more vulnerable to other attacks. However, the British did not stop there. They continued to improve their depth charge technology throughout the war. By the middle of 1943, the British Navy had introduced more effective designs, such as the Hedgehog and Squid systems. These new systems made a significant difference in how depth charges were used. The Hedgehog was a type of mortar, not a traditional depth charge. It was a set of small, explosive projectiles that were fired from a ship in a pattern. The idea was to saturate a section of the sea with explosives, increasing the likelihood of hitting a submarine. Unlike traditional depth charges, which were dropped and relied on timing to detonate at the right depth, the Hedgehog fired its charges in a spread, allowing for more precise attacks. It was also more effective in detecting submarines. The Hedgehog system was often used in combination with sonar, which could track the movements of U-boats underwater. The combination of the Hedgehog and sonar gave the British an advantage in detecting and attacking U-boats, even at greater depths. The Squid system was another innovation that further improved the British ability to target submarines. The Squid was a set of 3 barrel-like mortars mounted on a ship. It could fire depth charges at a specific depth, similar to the Hedgehog, but with even more precision. The Squid allowed for more controlled explosions, which increased the chances of hitting a U-boat. With the Squid, British warships could attack submerged U-boats more effectively and with greater accuracy, significantly improving their ability to defend the Atlantic. The improvements in depth charge technology were crucial in the war against the U-boats. Before these advances, the German submarines had an overwhelming advantage. U-boats operated by stealth. They could dive deep below the surface and remain undetected by surface ships. Once a U-boat was below a certain depth, it was difficult to track or attack. They could then wait for the perfect moment to strike, firing torpedoes at unsuspecting ships, often sinking them before the crew had time to react. For much of the early part of the war, U-boats were able to operate with impunity. They posed a significant threat to Allied shipping, causing major disruptions in the supply lines. The development of depth charges, and especially the Hedgehog and Squid systems, shifted the balance of power in the Atlantic. For the first time, the Allies had a weapon that could counteract the U-boat stealth. The depth charges allowed British warships to track and attack U-boats with far greater efficiency. These weapons did not make submarines completely vulnerable, but they reduced the U-boat's ability to operate unchecked. In the past, when a U-boat attacked a convoy or merchant ship, it could escape without much trouble. The British were limited in how they could fight back. Their ships were often slow and cumbersome, making it difficult to chase down the fast, stealthy U-boats. But with the development of better sonar technology and more effective depth charges, the Allies could now track U-boats more accurately. The depth charges could be deployed to hit the U-boat before it could escape, forcing it to surface or deterring it from continuing its attack. The U-boat's vulnerability was growing. The new depth charges were more accurate and had a wider blast radius, making it harder for the submarines to avoid being hit. A direct hit from a depth charge could seriously damage a U-boat, while multiple charges in the area could force the crew to abandon the mission or surface. For the first time, the British Navy had the upper hand in the battle against the German submarines. The U-boats, once seen as invincible, were now facing a weapon that could destroy them if they were caught. Despite these advances, the Germans did not give up easily. They tried to adapt their tactics to the changing circumstances. Some U-boats began operating in groups, using coordinated attacks to overwhelm British warships. They also tried to operate at greater depths, hoping to avoid detection by sonar and depth charges. These tactics were somewhat effective, but they could not completely counter the new weapons. The British were continually improving their technology and refining their tactics, which made it harder for the Germans to keep up. The British Navy's development of depth charges was a key turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. It allowed them to fight back against the U-boats and helped restore the critical supply lines across the Atlantic. The development of the Hedgehog and Squid systems was particularly important. These new technologies allowed the British to hunt U-boats more effectively and forced the Germans to change their tactics. The improvements in depth charge technology helped the Allies regain control of the Atlantic and ensured that vital supplies could reach Britain, ultimately contributing to the Allied victory in the war. The success of the depth charge marked a shift in naval warfare. Submarines, once seen as the ultimate weapon, were no longer invincible. The development of new technology and tactics had leveled the playing field. The British, who had once been at a disadvantage in the Battle of the Atlantic, were now on the offensive. The depth charge was the key to this transformation, and it played a significant role in the outcome of the war. The hunt for the German U-boat begins under a cold, dark sky, the vast expanse of the Atlantic stretching out in every direction. On board the British warship, HMS Uganda, the crew is tense, eyes fixed on the sonar screen. They know a U-boat is nearby, stalking their convoy. The air is thick with the tension of the chase. Every ping of the sonar grows louder, the rhythmic thump of the pulses echoing in the ship's hull. The crew knows that every second brings them closer to their target, but also closer to danger. On the bridge of the Uganda, the captain scans the horizon through binoculars. His face is set with determination, but beneath that is a flicker of unease. They know that the U-boat they're after is dangerous, the silent, deadly predator that is lurking just beneath the surface. The Uganda is a powerful ship, but the U-boat has the advantage of stealth, can submerge and slip away before they even know it's there. The hunt is a battle of nerves, and only one side can come out on top. Below the surface, the German U-boat U-557 is on the move. The crew is submerged, navigating carefully, trying to keep out of the Uganda's sonar range. The submarine's captain is calm, eyes fixed on the instruments in front of him. They've been in this position before, hunted, cornered, but always managing to slip away. The crew moves quietly, speaking in hushed tones as they adjust the depth and speed of the U-boat, careful not to make any noise that could give away their position. Every now and then, a sonar ping echoes through the water. The crew tenses each time, bracing for the inevitable. They know that if the British get too close, their only hope is to outrun or outsmart them. They can't afford to stay on this course for long. The U-boat's captain makes quick decisions, constantly adjusting their depth, trying to find the right balance between staying hidden and avoiding getting trapped. The tension rises as the British warship gets closer. The crew of the Uganda is on high alert, their hands hovering over the controls, ready to react at a moment's notice. The ship's sonar operator listens intently, tracking the U-boat's movement. The sound of the sonar is the only thing that cuts through the silence. Every ping seems to bring the Uganda closer, but the U-boat is evading them, always staying just a few steps ahead. On board the U-boat, the captain's eyes narrow as another sonar ping rings through the submarine. His hand tightens on the control panel. They're getting closer, but he doesn't panic. He's been through this before. He orders the crew to increase speed and change course, trying to make themselves harder to track. The crew moves quickly, each member knowing their role, working as a well-oiled machine. The silence inside the U-boat is almost unbearable as they wait, their fate hanging in the balance. The Uganda continues its pursuit, closing the gap. The sonar pings are getting louder now. The crew knows they're close. The captain orders the crew to prepare for the attack. On the deck, the gunners ready the depth charges. They will soon be in range. The tension on the Uganda is palpable, as every man on board knows the stakes. A single misstep could cost them their target or worse, their lives. As the crew of the U-boat continues to try to evade, the captain suddenly spots a problem. The British ship has gotten too close. The U-boat's crew knows they don't have much time left. The depth charges are coming, and there's nowhere to hide. The captain orders the crew to dive deeper, hoping to escape the blast zone. They increase speed, plunging into the depths of the ocean. The crew holds their breath, praying that the depth will be enough to avoid the incoming strike. The Uganda is on them now. The captain of the British ship orders the release of the depth charges. The crew works swiftly, deploying the weapons into the water with a mechanical precision. Each charge is designed to explode at a specific depth, creating a shockwave powerful enough to damage or destroy the U-boat. The countdown begins, and the crew waits, the seconds stretching out like hours. Then the first explosion rips through the water. The shockwave hits the U-boat hard, shaking it violently. Inside, the crew is thrown off balance as the blast rattles the entire submarine. The captain grips the control panel, but there's little he can do now. The second explosion follows quickly, the force shaking the U-boat again. The crew braces for more. The walls of the submarine groan under the pressure, and the sound of the water rushing in is deafening. The U-boat's crew struggles to maintain control, but the damage is already done. The submarine's hull is breached, and the pressure of the deep ocean is beginning to take its toll. Water begins to flood into the compartments. The crew moves quickly, trying to contain the damage, but it's clear that the U-boat won't survive much longer. The captain orders the crew to prepare for the worst. On the Uganda, the crew watches the water intently, waiting for any sign of the U-boat. The depth charges have done their job. The explosion's ripples spread out, causing a cloud of debris and bubbles to rise to the surface. There is no sign of the submarine. It's over. The crew of the Uganda breathes a collective sigh of relief, but there is no celebration. This is the reality of war, a constant cycle of pursuit and destruction. They know the U-boat is just one of many. The hunt will continue, but for now, this one battle is won. The Uganda continues its patrol, ready for whatever comes next. On board the U-boat, the crew is dealt a harsh blow. The submarine is sinking, and the captain gives the order to abandon ship. Some of the crew manage to escape, swimming toward the surface where they're either rescued by German boats or captured by the British. Others are lost to the deep waters of the Atlantic, swallowed by the same ocean that had once protected them. The pursuit is over, but the war rages on. The tension of the hunt, the stress of the chase, and the deadly power of the depth charges have all played their part in this high-stakes battle. The British Navy has scored a victory, but they know the U-boats will continue to fight back. The war is far from over, and the next hunt is just beginning. The crew of the German U-boat sits in the dimly lit control room, their eyes fixed on the instruments before them. Tension hangs heavy in the air. The hum of the engine is the only sound as they move deeper into the cold Atlantic waters. But beneath this mechanical rhythm, a deeper, more visceral fear stirs. The sonar pings of the British warship are growing louder, too close for comfort. The captain's hand tightens around the helm, his knuckles white. He knows they are being hunted, but he refuses to show fear. He knows that to give in to panic would be to guarantee their defeat. The captain stands tall, giving quick orders to his crew. Adjust depth, increase speed. His voice is steady, but the look in his eyes betrays the strain of the situation. The crew moves quickly, following their captain's orders. They make adjustments to the submarine's depth, hoping to throw off the British pursuit. But as the sonar pings grow louder and more frequent, they realize it's only a matter of time before the depth charges begin to fall. The first depth charge hits with a force that shakes the entire submarine. The hull groans as if the ocean itself is attempting to crush the vessel. The crew is thrown off balance, and the dim lights flicker. The walls tremble with the shock waves, and a deep, resonating sound fills the compartment. The captain grips the wheel, his jaw set in determination, but his eyes flicker with the understanding that the battle has just begun. "Stay calm," he shouts. "Get the damage control parties ready." His voice tries to mask the rising panic in his chest. The depth charges keep coming, each blast more violent than the last. The crew, though trained for moments like this, is not immune to the terror of being trapped in a metal tube at the mercy of the ocean. Water begins to flood into the lower compartments, and alarms ring through the submarine. Crew members scramble to seal off compartments, but the force of the explosions is relentless. It's clear now they are not going to outrun this attack. The captain realizes with growing horror that the damage is critical. The submarine is sinking. His mind races through his training, but there is no escape from this. The men below deck are struggling, trying to keep the boat from sinking, but there is too much water flooding in. It's not just a question of surviving the attack anymore. It's about giving his men a chance to escape before the entire vessel is swallowed by the sea. "Prepare to abandon ship." The captain's voice cracks as he barks the order. The men around him are in a daze, caught between the chaos and the cold realization that this will be their last stand. Some of the crew are too stunned to react. Others are already struggling to get to the escape hatches. The water is rising faster now, and panic begins to spread through the ship. There is no time left to save the boat. The final depth charge hits with a deafening roar, and the U-boat lurches violently. The whole submarine feels as if it's being torn apart. The lights flicker and then go out, leaving the crew in total darkness. The only sound now is the rush of water and the groans of the hull as it crumples under the pressure of the deep ocean. Those who are not already at the escape hatches race to join them. There are only a few moments left before the U-boat succumbs to the relentless weight of the ocean. Some men make it to the surface, clinging to the wreckage of the U-boat, shivering in the icy water. But others, trapped below deck or unable to escape in time, are lost to the depths. The water swallows the submarine, and silence takes over, broken only by the soft hiss of bubbles rising to the surface. The few survivors who cling to life in the cold waters do so in stunned silence, the shock of the attack still settling in. As they float in the dark waters of the Atlantic, the survivors wonder if help will come. Their thoughts race between survival and the grim reality of their comrades' deaths. A German U-boat relief vessel soon arrives, rescuing the lucky few who remain. They are pulled aboard, shaking and exhausted, their eyes hollow with the loss of so many of their comrades. Some will never speak of this day again, while others will carry the weight of it forever. On board the British warship, The crew watches in silence as the explosion of the final depth charge fades into the distance. They know the battle is over, but the victory is not sweet. The air is thick with the knowledge of what they have just done. They've sunk another U-boat, but in the process, they have taken lives. The crew can't ignore the reality of what war demands. The British sailors feel the relief of having completed their mission, but it is tempered by the grim knowledge that they have contributed to the destruction of human life. There is no glory in this battle, just a sense of duty, and the understanding that their work is not over. "Well done, men," the captain of the Uganda says, his voice heavy with the weight of the situation. "But stay sharp. The war's far from finished. There is no celebrating." The crew knows that every U-boat sunk is only one step in a long war, and the threat of the next attack is never far behind. For the sailors of the Uganda, the sense of triumph is fleeting. They've destroyed one enemy, but they know the U-boats are still out there, still hunting. The war will continue. There is no time for rest. The crew's tired eyes scan the horizon, knowing that, in war, there is no end to the hunt. The loss of so many U-boats in 1943 changed the course of the war in the Atlantic. The German Navy, once a dominant force in the battle for control of the sea lanes, found itself facing an unexpected and overwhelming challenge. With the increased effectiveness of British depth charges and anti-submarine tactics, the U-boat fleet, which had caused so much destruction in earlier years, was now being crippled. As the depth charges continued to take their toll, the number of U-boats available for combat steadily declined. This had a direct impact on Germany's ability to disrupt Allied shipping. For years, the U-boats had been the primary threat to convoys crossing the Atlantic. The Allies had relied on these vital supply lines to bring food, equipment, and reinforcements to Britain, but the Germans had used their submarines to sink merchant ships and warships, attempting to starve Britain into submission. The loss of so many U-boats meant that the German Navy could no longer sustain this strategy with the same effectiveness. With fewer U-boats in the water, the British were able to gain control of the Atlantic shipping lanes. For the first time in years, convoys could travel more safely, without the constant threat of being hunted by German submarines. This shift in power allowed vital supplies to reach Britain more consistently, strengthening the country's ability to fight the war. The British Navy could now escort convoys with greater efficiency, ensuring that materials needed for the war effort, ranging from food to weapons, arrived safely. This increase in successful convoys marked a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Germans had relied heavily on their U-boats to isolate Britain and cut off its supply lines. As their submarine fleet was diminished, the Allies gained a significant advantage. This change in the balance of power didn't just improve British morale. It also made it easier for the Allies to focus on other parts of the war, particularly the invasion of Europe. With the threat of the U-boats reduced, Britain could better prepare for the next phase of the conflict. In response to the mounting losses, Germany attempted to adjust its tactics. They turned to the idea of wolf-packing, where U-boats would operate in groups rather than alone. The idea was to overwhelm British defenses by launching coordinated attacks, hoping that the combined strength of multiple U-boats would be enough to evade depth charges and other countermeasures. The Germans believed that this would give them a better chance at sinking merchant ships and warships, despite the growing effectiveness of British technology. But the shift to wolf-packing came with its own set of challenges. While operating in groups made it harder for British warships to target individual U-boats, it also made the U-boats more vulnerable to attacks. The increased number of U-boats operating together drew more attention from British warships, which could now deploy depth charges in coordinated patterns that made it harder for the U-boats to escape. The technological advantage of the depth charges, combined with the British Navy's improved tactics and increased surveillance, made wolf-packing less effective than the Germans had hoped. This inability to adapt quickly enough had wide-reaching implications. As U-boat activity decreased, the Allies were able to shift their focus toward preparing for the invasion of Europe. The logistical challenge of landing troops and supplies in Normandy, France, would be one of the most difficult operations of the war. With the Atlantic shipping lanes under better control, the Allies could now dedicate more resources and manpower to planning and executing Operation Overlord, better known as D-Day. The successful landing in Normandy would open up a second front in Europe, a crucial step in defeating Nazi Germany. The weakening of the U-boat threat also gave the Allies more time and flexibility to build up their forces. Without the constant pressure of U-boat attacks, they could focus on expanding their air, naval, and ground forces, preparing for a full-scale invasion of Western Europe. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, the balance of power in the Atlantic had already tipped in their favor. The success of the D-Day landings was a pivotal moment in the war, bringing the Allies one step closer to victory in Europe. The reduction in U-boat activity didn't mean the end of the submarine threat entirely, but it significantly weakened Germany's ability to disrupt the Allied war effort. The loss of so many U-boats, combined with the increased British control of the Atlantic, was a decisive factor in the overall outcome of the war. The U-boats, once a major weapon in the German arsenal, were no longer a threat that could cripple Allied operations. The tide of the war in the Atlantic had turned, and with it, the course of the entire conflict shifted. The development and use of depth charges during the Battle of the Atlantic had long-lasting effects on naval warfare. This simple yet powerful weapon reshaped the way the Allies fought against submarines and laid the foundation for future technological advancements in anti-submarine warfare. By the end of World War II, the depth charge had proven to be one of the most effective weapons in neutralizing the German U-boat threat, and its success spurred further innovations that would continue to shape naval tactics for decades. As the war progressed, the Allies did not stop at the initial design of depth charges. They constantly improved the technology, making the charges more powerful and more accurate. They developed new methods to deploy them, integrating depth charges with sonar and radar to track and attack submarines with greater precision. The introduction of advanced systems like the Hedgehog and the Squid mortars allowed British ships to launch depth charges in a spread pattern, increasing the chances of hitting a submerged U-boat. These innovations marked a significant leap in naval warfare, demonstrating the importance of technological development in the battle against submarines. The success of the depth charge forced the German Navy to rethink its submarine tactics. For years, the U-boats had operated with relative freedom, using their stealth and speed to launch devastating attacks on Allied convoys. But as the depth charge technology improved, the U-boat crews were faced with an increasingly difficult task. The Allies were no longer as vulnerable as they had been in the early years of the war. The Germans had to adapt. They began to use tactics like wolf-packing, where groups of U-boats would work together to overwhelm Allied defenses. However, this too had its drawbacks, as the increased number of U-boats operating together made them more visible and more susceptible to coordinated attacks. The Germans found it harder to keep up with the evolving technology and tactics of the Allies, and this shift in the balance of power had significant consequences for the remainder of the war. The lessons learned during the Battle of the Atlantic did not end with the conclusion of World War II. The effectiveness of depth charges and the ongoing arms race between submarines and anti-submarine measures would influence naval strategies for decades to come. In the Cold War era, submarine warfare became a key component of naval strategies for both the United States and the Soviet Union. Both sides understood the importance of maintaining an effective submarine fleet, but they also realized the need for improved anti-submarine capabilities. The lessons learned from the Battle of the Atlantic led to the development of more advanced sonar systems, torpedoes, and other countermeasures. The fear of nuclear submarines equipped with ballistic missiles also led to a renewed focus on improving depth charge technology, as both sides sought to maintain control of the seas. Submarine warfare continued to evolve, but the tactics and technologies developed during World War II remained relevant for years to come. The use of depth charges influenced the design of new weapons and shaped naval doctrine, as both sides recognized the importance of staying one step ahead of the enemy. The Battle of the Atlantic had proven that the technological race between submarines and anti-submarine weapons was an ongoing and vital part of naval warfare. Yet, with all the technological advancements and strategic shifts, the human cost of submarine warfare was never forgotten. The losses on both sides were immense. Hundreds of U-boats were destroyed, and thousands of sailors, both German and Allied, lost their lives. The nature of submarine warfare meant that the crew of a U-boat or a warship faced constant risk, often without warning. The sudden depth charge attacks, the suffocating pressure of the deep sea, and the constant fear of being hunted created a brutal environment for those involved. the human cost was not limited to the men who fought on the front lines. The devastation caused by the U-boats had far-reaching consequences, affecting civilians and soldiers alike. The convoys that were attacked by the German submarines were vital lifelines for the British war effort, but each attack had the potential to take innocent lives. On both sides, sailors lived with the knowledge that they were part of a deadly game, where each success came at the expense of someone else's life. The loss of life in the Battle of the Atlantic highlighted the brutal reality of war, how technological advances and tactical brilliance were often accompanied by devastating human costs. As the camera pans over the wreckage of a U-boat sinking to the ocean floor, the silence is deafening. The water, once filled with the sound of battle, is now still. The rising bubbles from the wreckage are a haunting reminder of the lives lost, both on the surface and below. The survivors, shaken and exhausted, are left to reflect on the price of victory. The depth charges, the sonar pings, and the desperate attempts to escape or destroy each other have all led to this final moment. A single wrecked submarine, disappearing into the dark abyss of the Atlantic, stands as a symbol of the toll of the conflict. As the camera lingers over the wreck, a soft voiceover reflects on the larger picture of the war. The technological advancements, the changing tactics, and the toll of human life all played their part in shaping the outcome of the conflict. The Battle of the Atlantic, though a pivotal moment in naval history, was but one part of a larger war that spanned the globe. Yet, the innovations in anti-submarine warfare would echo for years to come, influencing both military strategy and the ongoing push for technological superiority. The ocean, vast and seemingly endless, becomes a quiet witness to the cost of war, a reminder that while the technology may change, the human toll remains a constant. The fight for control of the seas and the efforts to outsmart and outlast the enemy would continue long after the war ended, shaping the future of naval warfare.